The 1920s, most commonly known as the Roaring Twenties or even the Jazz Age, were a period of great change for Americans. The change of the 1920s first occurred with the changes of values and cultural roles of Americans living during this time. The culture and values of all Americans experienced some extremely great changes during the 1920s. Women saw the most changes during this time, especially regarding their appearances and values. There was a new breed of women who enjoyed the lifestyle of dancing, drinking, smoking, and wearing short, loose dresses, a lifestyle that was shocking to those of earlier generations. These rebellious women were the visual icon of the modern woman during this time. They were known as Schlaepfers, and they depicted the dramatic change in values and cultural roles of women during the 1920s. Women were increasing their roles within the American society as a whole. An increased amount of women were going to college and working outside the home. With the passing of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote, an increased amount of women took part in politics, asking Congress to pass laws that protected women labor and granted federal aid to schools. However, few women took advantage of voting rights. Many stayed away from the polls. The 1920s also experienced great changes in the culture and values of African Americans. There was a movement called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which was created by Marcus Garvey. This movement promoted the Back to Africa campaign. Garvey preached about racial pride and black identity, and this was important because, for the first time, black people were represented as having a common culture and cause to bind all of them together, no matter which country they lived in. Garvey himself was Jamaican. This would lead to a black artistic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance in New York City in the 1920s, when poets, writers, painters, and musicians came together to express feelings and experiences, especially about the injustices of the Jim Crow laws. Similar to African Americans in the 1920s, Latino Americans continued their struggle for equality. With the establishment of the Orden Hijos de America in San Antonio on October 13, 1921, Latino workers rallied together to raise awareness of civil rights issues and fight to obtain fair wages, education, and housing. All Asians during this time, with the exception of Filipinos, were excluded by law, denied citizenship and naturalization, and prevented from owning land. Religion in the 1920s was mainly centered around fundamentalism versus modernism. Americans during this time were becoming more materialistic and self-indulgent, causing them to move farther away from traditional Victorian ideals. This resulted in the rise of militant fundamentalism, as seen in the Scopes trial. American culture was also reflected in the way people spoke. Popular slang during this time, such as the bee's knees, big cheese, carry a torch, the cat's pajamas, and the cats were used regularly. Now for 1920s politics. Republicans dominated politics in the 1920s. The two major presidents during the 1920s were Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. The first president during this decade was Warren G. Harding, elected as an inoffensive compromise candidate in 1921. He awarded his friends with government jobs after winning the election. The Teapot Dome scandal occurred when one friend named Albert Fall, Harding's Secretary of Interior, took bribes from an oil company and allowed them to lease oil on government property, but the incident occurred after his death. Although his administration had many scandals, it had some genuine accomplishments, such as changing the steel industry's work hours from 12 hours a day to 8. He also slowed down military advancement. For every 5 battleships the U.S. or Britain built, Japan could build 3, while Italy and France could build 1 3/4. Then came Calvin Coolidge. During his presidency, the U.S. initiated the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by 50 nations. It was also during Coolidge's presidency that America saw the end of the Progressive Era. In 1924, during Coolidge's presidency, Congress passed the Johnson-Reed Act, which limited the number of immigrants that could be admitted into the U.S. from any country. The Scopes trial also occurred in the 1920s. The Scopes trial was an American legal case that tested the Butler Act, an act that made it unlawful to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man, as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. This act solely applied to any Tennessee state-funded schools and universities. The trial drew intense national publicity, with modernists pitted against traditionalists over the teaching of evolution in schools, as well as a fundamentalist interpretation of the Bible. The trial proved a critical turning point in the American creationism versus evolution controversy. Another controversial trial during the 1920s was the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. They were 2 Italian-born laborers and anarchists who were tried, convicted, and executed by electrocution on August 23, 1927, in Massachusetts for the alleged 1920 armed robbery and murder of a pay clerk and security guard in South Braintree, Massachusetts. The case incited controversy based on questions regarding culpability, the question of the innocence or guilt of Sacco and Vanzetti, and conformance, the question of whether the trials were fair to Sacco and Vanzetti. There were two major amendments passed during this era. The first one was the 18th Amendment, Prohibition, the practice of prohibiting the manufacture, transportation, import, export, sale, and consumption of alcohol and alcoholic beverages. Then came the 19th Amendment, which gave women the right to vote. And in 1924, Congress passed the National Origins Act, which established quotas for immigration into the U.S. It limited immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, permitted larger numbers of immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, and prohibited immigration from Asia. And now for 1920s music! The 1920s was very commonly known as the Jazz Age due to the rise in the popularity of jazz music, which was a result of the Great Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance occurred within the African American communities of Harlem, New York. With the gathering of many different African American musicians, jazz was born. It was an exciting and new genre, unlike anything else. Although jazz music was centered within the African American communities, African Americans were not the only ones to enjoy it. White Americans would go to nightclubs located in the Harlem communities, to clubs such as the Cotton Club, in order to listen and dance to jazz music. The mass production and purchase of radios played a large part in the spreading of jazz music, by bringing it to thousands of American homes nationwide. Jazz musicians such as King Oliver, Josephine Baker, Louis Armstrong, Kid O'Rye, and Duke Ellington were very influential musicians during the Jazz Age. And now for economy. After World War I, the economy of the U.S. was booming. Due to Harding's economic policies to push for higher tariffs in order to protect American businesses and disable the government control over the economy during the time, American enterprise saw increased growth, which also helped him become a very popular president. He also set up a new law for the Federal Trade Commission that reduced its power to regulate businesses. Frederick Taylor started the scientific management movement. Scientific management is the administration of a business or industry based on experimental studies of efficiency. This movement was a way to improve efficiency. They began by dividing work, procurement, production, marketing, and employee relations. This basically shifted all responsibility from the worker to the manager. It was the separation of hand and brain. You are not paid to think, there are people to do that for you. As a result, production increased by 32%, however wages only raised about. The scientific management movement led to the creation of welfare capitalism, which is a program that benefits the workers. This improved working conditions, the safety of the workers, and provided workers with paid vacations. This encouraged laborers to stay loyal to their company and discouraged people from entering into labor unions. Consumerism was a concept of life which was based on materialistic needs of possession. It increased as the personal income of Americans increased. Consumption was very beneficial to the American economy. The 1920s was the era where consumerism was born. War propaganda turned into ads for shoes, dresses, and other products. Ads persuaded Americans that owning the best products would make their lives better, as well as help them gain social popularity. As a result, American society became more materialistic than ever. Popular consumer products included the radio, phonographs, and automobiles. The telephone also grew in popularity and became one of the most important inventions of this time. The automobile industry was one of the major industries in the U.S. during the 1920s. As automobiles gained popularity nationwide, so did gas stations, fast food restaurants, and guest cottages, otherwise known as motels. More jobs for building highways and producing steel, tires, glass, and oil were needed as well. The 1920s income taxes resulted in economic growth within America. During the 1920s, the unemployment rate ranged at about 5.2%. During this decade, many more job opportunities became available, especially for women. Some women could find jobs as secretaries, others as factory workers. In 1921, the emergency tariff was enacted in order to temporarily relieve the problems of farmers by raising the rates on certain agricultural goods, such as wheat, sugar, meat, and wool, from foreign countries, therefore protecting domestic production of these goods. Although the 1920s income taxes brought economic prosperity to Americans, some minorities such as African Americans, immigrants, and white farmers still struggled with poverty. Farmers especially faced troubles when food prices dropped because, as a result, farmers were unable to sell their crops. The 1920s was known for its many dramatic changes within America, including those regarding fashion. This change occurred as an outcome of the changing in perspectives of American society as a whole. The Jazz Age was greatly reflected in the fashion of this time. Fashion for women saw the most change. The flapper look was the most commonly associated with the 1920s era. It was a trend that women all over America sought to follow. This look was of great contrast to how women were expected to dress before this time. The flapper look was reserved for more rebellious women. They were known for wearing short, shapeless dresses, listening and dancing to jazz music, and openly flouting social and sexual norm. Women wore a greatly increased amount of makeup. Popular hairstyles for women in the 1920s included the bobbed haircut, or just short hair in general. Accessories such as the cloche hat, detailed stockings, and long necklaces were very popular. Coco Chanel, the most widely known clothing designer during this time, greatly influenced much of the fashion women wore in the 1920s. Men also saw great changes in fashion. Style for men became far more simple and comfortable. The fabrics and colors of the clothing were much brighter, reflecting the happy feel of the 1920s era. Suits were made to give men a slimmer, more boyish look. The attire of athletes also influenced the fashion of men. Plus pants, which were influenced by golf stars, as well as raccoon coats and camel hair polo coats, which were worn by football star Herald Grange, became very popular in the fashion mainstream for men's fashion in the 1920s. Sportswear became fashionable for both men and women. Different social classes dressed similarly. The only difference was the quality of the clothing's material. Lower classes would often wear mass-produced clothing rather than handmade pieces reserved for those who could afford it. During the 1920s, the film industry of America took on its modern form, mainly centering around Hollywood, which dominated in film production during this time, releasing around 700 films each year. This was America's golden age. Films grew in popularity primarily due to the increased featuring of adventurous plots, glamorous characters, sophisticated settings, and sex appeal. Silent films mainly dominated the industry until the late 1920s, with the introduction of sound. Films such as The Jazz Singer, the first major motion picture with synchronized dialogue sequences, made in 1927, were very popular amongst Americans. Due to an increase of leisure time available to Americans during the 1920s, many people nationwide discovered an interest in spectator sports, such as baseball, golf, and college football. Football players such as Harold Red Grange, halfback for the University of Illinois, attracted thousands to the sport. Baseball was even more popular with players such as Babe Ruth, the baseball superstar who made the 1920s the golden age for the sport. With the growing film industry and rise of mass media came an increase in the recognition of celebrities in America. Charlie Chaplin was an English comic actor and filmmaker who grew in popularity in America. He was best known for his silent films, which he not only starred in, but wrote, directed, and produced as well. Gloria Swanson was but one of many glamorous female stars that emerged in the 1920s. She was also a fashion icon to women all over America. Josephine Baker was an American-born French dancer, singer, and actress. Once described as the most famous woman in the world, Josephine Baker started out at the age of 15 in St. Louis. Many new dances were introduced to Americans during the 1920s. New developments in the music genres such as jazz and blues brought about new rhythms of dance. Dance was especially popular amongst the younger Americans, who enjoyed exciting nightlives. Dances such as the Black Bottom and the Charleston gained popularity after being featured in popular films. With more leisure time on their hands, Americans took on hobbies such as dancing, listening to radios, watching movies, and watching spectator sports. Although alcohol was prohibited with the passing of the 18th Amendment, bootleggers would smuggle alcohol into nightclubs. Smoking was also gaining popularity, even amongst women. Parties were wild in the 1920s. They often featured the drinking of alcoholic beverages, jazz music, and dancing.